She's not all there, my son told the retirement office clerk. Calm, convincing, like I was already a ghost in the room. But I brought every deed, every document, every proof that I hadn't disappeared. I'd been erased. Locked cabinets, forged signatures, and a house I didn't know I'd lost. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was betrayal in a tailored suit. Now, I'm not fighting to prove I'm sane. I'm fighting to reclaim what was stolen, my voice, my past, and the home that still remembers me. And if you think I'm too old to fight back, you don't know what a mother's silence has been holding. The air inside the retirement office was so dry, it made my eyes sting. Everything in that building looked like it hadn't been touched since 1993. The grayish linoleum floors, scuffed from years of restless waiting, flickering fluorescent lights, humming like they were tired of being awake, and chairs lined against the walls like soldiers on punishment detail. I stepped in carrying a worn leather satchel, old, cracked at the corners, stuffed with yellowed documents, birth certificates, house deeds, utility statements, and wills. Proof, evidence, my sanity. I had to park 3 blocks away because the visitor lot was full, and by the time I reached the front desk, my knees were pulsing. But I stood tall. I wasn't going to let them see that I'd limped my way in. I wasn't going to let them think I was not all there. Those words, his voice, my son, she's not all there. He didn't even lower his tone when he said it like I wasn't even sitting 2 feet from him, like I was already a fading photograph on a cluttered shelf. He was speaking to the clerk at the last meeting, tight smile, polished watch, the faint cologne he knew gave me a headache. I remember how her eyes darted to me, then back to him, then to the computer screen, unsure which direction to lean. That was Callum's gift. He didn't need to yell. His power came wrapped in civility. Today, I came alone. Mrs. Hallbridge, the receptionist called, eyes flickering from her screen to me. Yes, I said steady. I have an appointment with someone regarding my pension file and power of attorney forms. My son filed them without consulting me. I didn't smile. I didn't explain. She nodded, motioned toward the seating area. The seats were hard plastic and far too low. My bag rested on my knees, and I clutched it like a life preserver. Inside, the deeds weighed more than paper should. Callum always liked things neat, clean, controlled. He'd ironed his t-shirts at 16 and color-coded his class binders. I used to admire that in him, thought maybe I'd done something right. But when Richard, my late husband, began to decline, mentally, emotionally, it was Callum who stepped in like a younger version of him, same tone, same dismissive sighs. I should have known then. A door opened, and a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a voice clipped like scissors called me in. Mrs. Hallbridge, I'm Nancy Darnell. We spoke briefly last week. She led me down a hallway that felt more like a corridor in a holding facility than a civic office. Once in the room, I placed the satchel on the table, unbuckled the clasp, and slid out the thick stack of documents. They smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I brought everything, I said. Every house deed, every bank transaction, anything with my name on it. Her eyebrows lifted. That's quite a lot. Well, when your son tries to have you declared mentally unfit without telling you, you bring everything. She gave me a look I couldn't read, then began flipping through the files. I watched her hands, watched how they slowed at certain pages, how her expression tightened. Callum's voice echoed again. She's not all there. I'd raised that boy, sat through asthma attacks and science fairs and tantrums when his cereal touched the milk too soon. I'd walked away from my own career to be home with him, thinking that's what mothers were supposed to do. But at some point, my sacrifices stopped looking noble and started looking inconvenient. He stopped asking, stopped calling. When he did come by, it was to move things around, suggest I get rid of the clutter, hire someone to manage the bills. I started hiding important documents after that. Nancy looked up. Your son stated that you've been having memory lapses, confusion with dates and finances. That's not true, I said. He's twisting every delayed phone call, every missed appointment. Do I forget sometimes? Sure, I'm 72. I also remember the layout of our first house in Denver and the scent of my mother's lilac soap. I remember when Callum broke his arm falling off the monkey bars. I remember the way my husband dismissed my concerns with a laugh that cut deeper than a slap. Her gaze didn't falter, but I saw the smallest flicker in her expression. doubt, maybe even sympathy. I continued. He says I'm not all there, but I've been carrying this family's legacy on my back for decades. This, I tapped the documents. This is mine. I have the mental clarity to know what's happening. He just didn't think I'd fight back. Her eyes scanned the last page and paused. You're right, she said slowly. Your name is on all these deeds. Sole ownership. Your signature is consistent throughout. And yet, the power of attorney paperwork has already been processed. What? My voice cracked. Without my consent? She leaned back. There's an affidavit. You were marked as present, but unable to respond. Signed by a notary, Michael Callum Hallbridge. My heart stopped for a beat. My son had signed as a witness, fabricated it. I felt the weight of betrayal settle deeper in my chest, like a slow, methodical crushing of the lungs. I steadied my hands, now trembling slightly on the stack of documents. He thought I wouldn't notice, thought I wouldn't fight, thought I wasn't all there. But I was. I am. And I brought the deeds. Nancy Darnell flipped through the documents slowly, as though the weight of each page required extra thought to lift. Her manicured fingers paused briefly on the deed to the lake cabin in Pinedale, eyes narrowing just slightly. It was a look I recognized. The look of someone beginning to suspect the story they were handed didn't quite add up. I sat stiffly across from her, fingers laced tightly in my lap, watching her read over the evidence of my own life. The stack of papers between us wasn't just documentation. It was a history, a timeline of every move, every investment, every decision Richard and I had made when we were still pretending we were a team. Some of the property documents still bore both our names, the ink slightly faded on his. After his passing, the refiled versions listed me as sole owner. I had them all: legal updates, insurance transitions, notarized statements, everything neat, precise. And still, it had come to this. Nancy cleared her throat. You've kept excellent records. I had to, I replied. He never let me in the room when we signed things, just handed them to me with a pen. I started keeping copies when I realized some of them looked different later. She paused again, this time meeting my eyes. He? My husband, Richard, Callum's father. A flicker of recognition passed across her face, likely from the surname on the forms. She nodded, as though connecting dots she hadn't realized were even part of the same picture. Tell me something, I said carefully. If I have all this, deeds, bank history, notarized affidavits, how could my son file for power of attorney without a formal evaluation? She didn't answer immediately, just laid her pen down with deliberate calm and leaned back in her chair. Mrs. Hallbridge, she began, tone softer. The power of attorney request. It was filed several months ago. There was a notary present, paperwork signed. It included a statement claiming you were lucid but unable to make safe decisions for yourself. The witness signature was your son's. That last line was almost a whisper. I blinked slowly, not because I was surprised, but because hearing it confirmed what I had feared. He hadn't just dismissed me. He'd erased me. Nancy leaned forward again, perhaps sensing I needed something tangible to hold on to. But this, she gestured to the documents, tells a very different story. These transactions are accurate. Property records are in your name. There's no indication of financial mismanagement on your end. I gave a bitter smile. That's because there wasn't any. The only thing I mismanaged was trusting the men in my life. I hadn't meant to say that aloud, but there it was, suspended in the sterile air between us. Nancy didn't flinch. Can I ask about the cabin? Was it actively in use? No, I replied. Not since my daughter left. Her pen paused mid-stroke. You have a daughter? Had. Maybe still. But have felt like a reach. Faye, I said, the name catching in my throat. She left when she was 19. Said she couldn't take it anymore. Said we were all pretending. I could still see her, the way she shoved the suitcase into the car trunk, hands shaking, lips trembling with fury and fear and something else. Freedom, maybe. I had begged her to stay, offered to talk things out, promised to change, but I hadn't even known what that meant at the time. She and Callum were different, I told Nancy. He absorbed it, learned to blend in, say the right things. She fought back, and when she realized no one was coming to help, she left. Nancy gave a tight nod, scribbling something onto the folder's tab. Estranged? More like exiled, I said quietly. I didn't kick her out, not technically, but I sided with Richard. I always sided with Richard. There was silence in the room, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy, packed with every missed call, every unopened letter, every unspoken apology. Nancy slid the stack back toward me. You brought more than just deeds. I nodded, pulling out a side folder. Inside were bank statements, transfers, and legal notes, paper trails meticulously tracked. I wasn't always detail-oriented, but when you start to feel yourself fading in your own home, you find ways to stay tethered. One account caught her eye. This isn't tied to your listed residence. Do you recognize this routing number? I leaned in, frowning. The account was opened 3 years ago, under my name, at a bank I had never visited. Regular withdrawals. Nothing huge, just enough to avoid suspicion. It was my handwriting on the signature line, but the strokes were off, slightly tilted. I've never seen this, I said slowly, but I know who has. Nancy looked up sharply. You're saying these withdrawals, this account, was fabricated? I'm saying Callum had access to every piece of mail that came through that house. I'm saying he mimicked my signature on a dozen holiday cards when he was 13, and I'm saying I haven't made a single withdrawal from any account without seeing it in my passbook. The realization was sour in my mouth. Nancy's voice had hardened slightly. If that's the case, there's a separate legal track this could fall under. I've been saying that, I snapped, then immediately caught myself. I softened. I'm sorry. It's just, this has been happening so slowly. And I let it. I let it because for years I believed that if things were calm, that meant they were fine. Nancy didn't interrupt. I used to hear Richard say things like, "You always overreact," or, "Let me handle the finances. It's just easier that way." And eventually I stopped asking. I let my silence be mistaken for agreement. Callum learned that language like it was his first. And now, here I was, 68 years old, clutching a pile of evidence to prove I wasn't losing my mind. There was a knock at the door. Another clerk stepped in and handed Nancy a folder. Her brow furrowed as she read the top sheet, eyes scanning quickly. She handed me the copy. It was a confirmation of power of attorney, signed, filed, and stamped by the county office. Your son has already legally positioned himself as your decision-maker, she said gently. I sat back in the chair, the room tilting slightly. I wasn't losing my grip on reality. I was watching it get taken from me, one signature at a time. Nancy looked at me like she saw something different now. Not just a concerned mother, not just an aging woman with a file full of old papers, but someone under siege. She tapped the folder lightly. But this isn't over, not by a long shot. And I nodded because it wasn't. I had more than papers. I had memory. I had motive. I had something to fight for. I used to think control came in shouts and slammed doors. In the early years of marriage, I braced myself for outbursts that never came. Richard never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He could disarm with a glance and unravel an entire argument with a single, dismissive laugh. You're too sensitive, he'd say, folding his newspaper with practiced indifference. Try not to read into everything. He always made it sound like I was the one pulling threads from thin air. And maybe I was. At first. The beginning was filled with smiles, roses on Tuesdays, and weekends in quiet towns. But then came the first decision made without me. The car trade-in I found out about 2 days later. Then the forgotten bank login he accidentally reset. The dinner plans canceled without consulting me, the holiday visits booked before I was told. Little things. Things that could be explained. Things I didn't realize were bricks in a wall until the door was sealed shut. I see it more clearly now. Sitting in that gray room with Nancy and the paper trail of my own slow erasure, it clicks in my head like a chain falling into place. I didn't just live with a controlling man. I adapted to him. I molded myself around his expectations so skillfully that I forgot what I used to be shaped like. And then I passed that mold onto my son. Callum's voice is sharper, more modernized. He uses text speak and logic walls instead of scorn. But the tone? The underlying chill that tells you your instincts are unreliable and your memory suspect? That's all Richard. I remember one particular night. Callum was 15. Faye had come home late from a protest in town, her jeans grass-stained, eyes wild with indignation. She tried to explain what the march had been about, Something to do with a woman being harassed in the school district. Richard barely let her finish. "Oh, don't be dramatic," he said, swirling his scotch. "It's not harassment if no one gets hurt." I had stood behind him, lips pressed thin, heart pounding. I saw the way Faye's face crumbled, not because she was afraid of him, but because she realized she couldn't reach him. Or me. Callum had watched it all silently from the hallway, his arms folded. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His father had done the talking for both of them. And I'd gone into the kitchen and made tea. I told myself I was keeping the peace. That phrase haunts me now. "I'm just trying to make things easier," Callum said last week when I confronted him about the power of attorney paperwork. Easier. Just like his father used to say. He didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. I saw my reflection in the glass screen. This graying woman clutching a dish rag like a lifeline, asking her son not to take away her agency. And he was calm, so calm, as if I were simply overreacting. "You're imagining things, Mom. You always do when you're stressed." That's what Richard said the night he hit our joint tax returns. I'd asked him why the refund was lower than expected, and he chuckled. "You've been watching too much news. Paranoia isn't attractive on you." And then he handed me a set of earrings. A distraction. A reset. Callum didn't give me jewelry. He gave me pamphlets for elder care facilities, left them on the coffee table, unopened, as if they'd wandered there on their own. And I did what I always do. I hesitated. I wondered if maybe I had been forgetful. Maybe I had misplaced that document. Maybe I was too emotional when I asked why he'd changed my bank's contact info. Faye would have shouted. She would have demanded answers. But I silenced myself long ago, because I was taught that raising your voice meant you'd already lost the argument. I remember the moment that realization sank in. It was a week after Richard's funeral. The house was quiet. Callum had come over to help, and within 10 minutes he was sorting through drawers, reorganizing files, making comments about how you shouldn't be dealing with this alone. That was his refrain. His brand of kindness always came bundled with control, and I let him. Because the alternative, being alone in that silence, felt worse, until it didn't. Until I started finding things missing. Until I noticed my prescription bottles weren't where I'd left them. Until I opened a drawer and found a document I knew I hadn't signed, already notarized in ink that wasn't mine. There's no thunderclap when authority slips from your hands, just a slow fading of your voice in rooms you once ruled. It didn't happen all at once. It happened when I stopped attending the financial meetings with Richard because they dragged on too long. It happened when I let Callum speak for me at the bank, just this once, because I had a cold and didn't want to strain my voice. It happened when I stopped reading the fine print, stopped questioning the decisions, trusted the men I loved to look out for me. And they used that trust like currency. I see it now, clearly, like a portrait in full light. Nancy had said the power of attorney wasn't the end of things, but it felt like a warning bell, a signal that I was one step away from being written out of my own life entirely. I leaned back in the creaky office chair, hands still trembling from the weight of memory. There was no point in self-pity, but there was power in clarity. Because now, finally, I knew what I was fighting. Not just the paperwork, not just the lies. I was fighting the quiet voice inside me that still asked, what if they're right? That voice had lived there for decades, installed carefully by Richard and maintained by Callum. But I was done listening to it. "May I see the forms my son submitted?" I asked, the words firm, though my voice was quieter than I intended. Nancy nodded, pulling out a slim manila file from a drawer behind her. "Of course. These are the documents we received when he filed the initial power of attorney request. There's also a financial summary attached." She slid the folder across the table. I opened it slowly, bracing myself for a hit I couldn't yet name, but could already feel in my bones. The top page was a general authorization form, typed, clean, efficient. My name at the top, my birth date, my signature, only it wasn't mine. The strokes were too even. The M in Marianne curved like someone practiced it. But I never wrote it that way. Mine always looped too wide on the first arch, habit from grade school penmanship drills. And then I saw it. Property transfer authorization. It listed my childhood home on Covewood Lane. Sold 2 months ago. I blinked, looking for the fine print. Maybe it was an error. Maybe it hadn't been finalized. But the stamp was there. County approved, dated, processed. That house wasn't just property, I said, feeling my throat tighten. It was my mother's. She left it to me when she died. Nancy looked up. It was marked as an underused asset. The form says it was sold to consolidate your financial care under a single plan. Care. That word made me nauseous. My mother used to say, a house is a memory you can walk through. That house still smelled like the lemon polish she used on the banister. The attic had her old suitcases and boxes of dried lavender tied in twine. The back window still bore the scratch marks from when my brother tried to sneak in through the rose trellis. And now it was gone. Just like that. No call. No conversation. Just erased. Can I see the pension records? I asked, barely above a whisper. Nancy handed me another sheet. Line after line of transactions, transfers, consolidations, withdrawals. Most were standard. But one detail caught my eye. A pension account I hadn't touched since Richard passed, one I'd let sit untouched, had been drawn down. Monthly, small increments, starting 5 years ago. I didn't authorize this, I said. I would have remembered this. These withdrawals. What were they for? She flipped the sheet over. That's the thing. The statements don't match the retirement account ledger. The money was routed to an auxiliary account in your name, but not listed in your current records. I leaned forward. Show me. She pulled the linked record. The account name was correct. Marianne J. Hallbridge. The bank address unfamiliar. There were withdrawals going back 5 years, grocery stores, furniture outlets, a vacation rental site, a few medical supply purchases, all average enough to fly under any red flag, all easily overlooked, if someone wasn't looking. I wasn't, until now. That's not my account, I said, voice flat. Nancy's eyes darkened. I believe you. I closed the folder slowly. My hands felt like they didn't belong to me. Everything that once tethered me to my life felt like it had been quietly unplugged. I needed air. But I also needed to remember, to stitch myself back together. So I opened the inner flap of my satchel and pulled out a folded photograph, creased at the corners, softened by years of being handled. My mother, standing in front of the Covewood house. Her dress patterned with sunflowers, gray hair tucked under a scarf, her smile halfway between exhaustion and triumph. She'd just finished paying off the mortgage. That house was her legacy. And now my son had turned it into a line item. My grip on the photo tightened until my fingers trembled. I thought back to the last Christmas we all spent together in that house. Richard had commandeered the seating chart, telling me, "Let Callum handle the details. He's better with numbers." I hadn't argued. I was too tired. Then the gift list had been modified. My handmade scarf for Faye replaced with a tech gadget Richard said she might actually use. The roast recipe altered. The music changed. All done with smiles, with laughter, with little winks from father to son. I sat at the table that night smiling for the family photo, but I felt like a ghost. I had stopped being part of decisions. I was scenery. Later that night, I overheard Richard and Callum talking in the den. "She's not cut out for logistics," Richard had said, swirling his whiskey. "Let her think she's in charge. She needs that." Callum had chuckled. It was the same chuckle I heard when he told me I didn't need to manage my online accounts anymore. "It's too stressful for you, Mom. Let me simplify it." He used the word simplify like he was doing me a favor, like silence was a gift. I placed the photograph carefully back into the folder. Nancy said nothing. She didn't need to. The truth was written across every line of those forms. I had been managed out of my own life, one decision at a time, masked as care, wrapped in false concern. This wasn't just about finances. It wasn't even about legality. It was about identity, memory, the invisible thread between generations. My mother's hands had scrubbed the kitchen floor of that house. My daughter's laughter had once echoed through its narrow hallway, and now both of them were gone. I'd let Richard shut Faye out. I'd let Callum take over. But now I was done letting things happen to me. There were missing pieces in the paper trail. But more than that, there were missing pieces in me I needed to retrieve, starting with that account. I looked Nancy dead in the eye. I want every document, every linked transaction, every notary record. I want to know how deep this goes. Her jaw tightened. Then we'll find it. Faye's room still smells faintly like her. That gentle blend of peppermint shampoo and old books that clung to the walls long after she left. I keep the door closed most days. Not out of anger, never that, but to preserve it, to preserve her. The curtains are drawn, the bed still made with the same faded quilt I stitched when she was 13. A few stuffed animals remain along the shelf, carefully positioned, dust-lined. Her bookshelf is exactly as she left it. Bronte, Vonnegut, Angela Davis, Judy Blume. There's a notebook with a cracked spine wedged behind the headboard, its cover worn from the way she used to carry it everywhere. I found it once, years after she left, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I don't need her secrets. I know I already broke them. Our silence didn't begin with shouting. It began with expectations. Faye was always fierce. Even as a little girl, she questioned everything. Why boys got to sit in front during assemblies, why teachers called girls bossy and boys leaders, why I insisted on cardigans and combed hair when she preferred band tees and paint under her fingernails. She had a way of seeing cracks in things. And she didn't just see them. She spoke them aloud. At first I admired that, thought it was a phase of boldness, something she'd outgrow like braces or crushes on musicians she'd never meet. I didn't understand it was her nature, that her defiance wasn't rebellion, it was truth-telling. But I was too conditioned to see the difference. I grew up believing women were safe if they stayed quiet, palatable, polite. My mother was strong, but she paid a price for it. She fought for that house on Covewood after my father died, fought neighbors, zoning boards, mortgage companies. She never remarried. She worked 2 jobs. And people whispered, called her difficult, said she must be hard to live with. So I promised myself I'd never become a woman people whispered about. And when I had Faye, I promised myself she wouldn't be one either. I started early. Politeness drills before birthday parties. Dress codes for every family gathering. Fix your hair, I'd say. Stand up straight, speak properly, don't interrupt. By middle school, she began to look at me with a kind of guarded distance, as if she were already learning I might not be a safe place for her truth. Callum never questioned anything. He folded right into Richard's expectations, his teacher's praise, his grandparents' pride. I clung to that ease like it was a blueprint, a relief. But Faye? She pushed. She protested school dress codes, joined debate club, challenged teachers. When she came home furious one day because a male coach made a comment about ladylike behavior, I told her to be careful, to choose her battles. She stared at me like I was a stranger. You always tell me to speak up, she said, until it actually matters. That was the first time she made me feel ashamed. The second time came years later. Her last Christmas at home. She was 19, just back from her first semester at college. Hair buzzed short, jacket covered in pins, confidence pouring out of her in waves. She was brilliant, but she was tired. Tired of justifying herself. At dinner, Richard made a crack about one of her friends, something about gender pronouns and attention-seeking. Callum laughed. I winced. Faye stood up, said she wouldn't sit through a meal where people mocked identities they didn't understand. Richard waved her off. You're always making a scene. And I tried to keep the peace. Faye, please, I said, my voice tight. Just let it go. It's Christmas. Her fork clattered onto her plate. You never back me up. I opened my mouth, but nothing came. She walked out of the house 15 minutes later. I followed her to the driveway, snow crunching under my slippers. Don't do this, I begged. She threw her duffel into the trunk. I tried, Mom. I really did. But I don't think you see me. I think you see some version of me you can control. That's not true. She looked at me, really looked, and I felt like I was shrinking under her gaze. The only time you hear me, she said, is when I say something you already agree with. Those were the last words she spoke to me. She drove away that night. No hugs, no goodbyes, just taillights bleeding into the snowfall. I stood in the road long after the engine faded until the cold seeped into my bones. In the days that followed, I told myself she'd come back, that it was a phase, that she'd realize I was just trying to protect her, that I was scared for her, scared that the world would crush a girl who spoke too loudly, burned too brightly. But maybe she didn't need protection. Maybe she needed a mother who didn't flinch when her daughter outgrew her. The silence stretched into weeks, then months, then years. I wrote letters I never sent, called numbers that stopped working. I searched her name online but never found anything definitive, just a few social media ghosts. A photo at a protest in Seattle, hair longer now, arm linked with someone else's. I kept her room untouched, not because I expected her to return, but because I didn't know how to mourn someone still alive. I didn't tell anyone how much it hurt. Richard never asked. Callum said she was being dramatic, immature, just like always. I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because by then, I'd stopped raising my voice even in my own head. Now, sitting across from Nancy with the truth about my finances unraveling in front of me, I think of Faye. I wonder if she'd see this as karma, or tragedy, or both. Would she care? Would she help? I don't know. But I know this much, I failed her. Not in some singular, catastrophic moment, but in all the little silences. The shoulder shrugs. The apologies I made for the men in our lives instead of the accountability I should have demanded. And now her room is a museum of all the things I never said. Her sweater still drapes across the chair by the window. A small crystal pendant hangs from the lamp switch. One drawer remains half open, as if waiting to be filled again. And yet, the silence is louder than ever. I pull the door closed behind me, not because I want to forget, but because I finally remember. Callum was always composed. Even as a child, his emotions didn't flare. They condensed. Where Faye would scream and slam doors, he would retreat behind his silence, watching, calculating. It unnerved me then, though I couldn't explain why. It unnerves me more now. I remember walking in on him once. He must have been 12, standing in front of the mirror in his room, practicing expressions. A smile, then a frown. A look of concern, then boredom. He shifted through them like masks. He turned and saw me and didn't flinch. "Just seeing what works," he said. Then he turned back to the glass. By 15, he'd learned that tone was more powerful than tantrums. He wielded calm like a scalpel, precise, controlled, impossible to refute. And he had a knack for seeing what people wanted to hear, then weaponizing it. Just like his father. Richard didn't yell either. He simply undercut. A subtle smirk, a raised eyebrow, a well-placed, "Don't be ridiculous." That's all it took to make you feel absurd for feeling anything at all. Callum learned early that vulnerability was a flaw. I watched it happen. Watched how Richard would swat down tenderness with cynicism, how Callum would bottle it up. When his dog died, he didn't cry. He went to his room and realphabetized his bookshelf. And I mistook that for strength. I told myself he was mature, independent, a natural leader. He grew into a man of suits and sharpened language, moved to the city, became VP of something or other at a firm I couldn't pronounce. He stopped hugging me around 30, stopped calling by 32. But he never stopped managing. When Richard passed, Callum moved in like a consultant, told me what to keep, what to throw out. Paid the estate lawyer directly, bought me a new phone and set it up himself. Said it was easier this way. Passwords, banking apps, calendar reminders, all linked to his accounts. I didn't resist, not then. It felt helpful. Now I can see it for what it was, a quiet acquisition. The door opened, and Callum stepped into the retirement office like he owned it. Crisp suit, dark tie, phone in hand. He didn't look at me, not right away. He looked at Nancy. "Apologies," he said, flashing a brief smile. "Traffic." His tone was clipped, performative. He knew how to charm an audience. He just didn't care enough to hide the contempt beneath it. Nancy gestured toward the seat beside me. "We've been reviewing some documentation. There are a few inconsistencies we're clarifying." Callum sat, crossing one leg over the other. "Of course. Anything I can do to assist." I turned to him. "You sold the Covewood house." Finally he looked at me. Flat, unapologetic. "It wasn't being used, Mother. It was fiscally irresponsible to let it sit empty." "That wasn't your decision to make." His jaw tightened. "It was. Because you've made it clear you can't make them yourself." Nancy's pen paused mid-note. "You don't know what's best for yourself anymore," Callum continued, tone like ice. "You forget things. You lose track of bills. You don't respond to emails unless I follow up 3 times. That's not independence. That's decline." I stared at him, stunned, not by the words, but by the certainty in them. He believed it, every syllable. "You're doing this to protect me?" I asked. "I'm doing this because no one else will." Nancy cleared her throat. Mr. Hallbridge, I'll have to stop you there for a moment. He turned to her, eyes narrowed. Excuse me? She reached for a second folder, thinner, marked with a red tab. Before we continue, I'm required to inform you that a formal complaint has been lodged with the Office of Adult Protective Services. The complaint names you as a potential party in the financial exploitation of a dependent adult. The silence in the room crackled. Callum blinked. That's absurd. The complaint was filed anonymously, Nancy said calmly, but it includes copies of documents, transaction records, and a sworn statement outlining patterns of unauthorized control and asset transfer. He shifted in his seat, just slightly, but I saw it, the first crack. You think I'm abusing her? He said, his voice rising for the first time. You think I've done anything except try to help? Nancy was unfazed. The complaint doesn't accuse, it initiates an investigation. Callum turned to me then, eyes sharp. Did you file this? I didn't blink. Would it matter if I had? He leaned forward. You really think dragging this into court will make you look competent? It hit me then, how badly he needed me to look incompetent, how deeply he believed the narrative he'd built. I don't need to look competent, I said. I need to be heard. He scoffed, but Nancy interjected before he could speak. There will be a hearing, she said, and both parties will present their case. He stood, straightened his tie, and forced a smile. Then I look forward to clearing this up. But when he left the room, he didn't look back, and I stayed seated. It was the sound that made me stop, the soft, final click of a lock sliding into place. I stood outside the linen closet, holding a basket of clean towels, when I first noticed the change. The small cabinet beside the stairs, where I used to keep old documents, medication refills, and boxes of keepsakes, was no longer opening. I tried the handle again, expecting maybe it had jammed, but it was firm, deliberately sealed. Callum, I had asked that evening, holding the knob in one hand. Did you put a lock on this? He didn't even look up from his phone. Just organizing things. Some of it's not safe to have lying around. What things? Paperwork, medications. There's no need for you to worry about it. That line, that exact phrase. I'd heard it before, from Richard, from doctors, from realtors and attorneys and PTA presidents. That soft, paternal tone men use when they're making decisions you're not meant to question. There's no need for you to worry about it. So I didn't, at least not that day. But the next week, when I went to refill my daily pill organizer, something felt off. The bottle of amlodipine was lower than I remembered. Not by much, just enough to make me doubt myself. 2 or 3 pills. Gone. My sleeping aid was even lighter. The expiration label I'd memorized last month had changed. A new bottle, a new supplier. I hadn't placed an order. I checked the online pharmacy portal. My password had been changed. I waited for Callum to leave the house before going back to the cabinet. The lock was a simple slide mechanism. I remembered where we kept the spare keys. Callum must have forgotten. Or maybe he never expected me to check. Inside, everything was stacked in neat, color-coded folders. Insurance documents, bank records, prescriptions, all in my name. None in my control. And that's when I saw the file labeled Cognitive Care Plan. I opened it, fingers trembling. Inside was a printed evaluation form I didn't recognize. A checklist filled out in blue ink. My name, my date of birth, and assessments of memory decline, confusion, occasional paranoia, symptoms I didn't recognize, signatures I didn't write, a doctor I'd never met. I sat on the floor in front of that cabinet, back pressed to the wall, the file open across my lap. My hands shook so badly I had to steady them against the wood trim. He was building a case, slowly, silently, and I had been helping him. Every time I let him run an errand for me, every time I allowed him to schedule an appointment or fill a prescription, to save me time, I gave him more material. I wasn't just being managed, I was being erased. I closed the cabinet, replaced the key, and went straight to the guest bedroom. I pulled an empty notebook from the drawer, the kind I used to use for grocery lists and Christmas card notes, and I started writing. The date, the dosage change, the cabinet lock, the altered login. I wrote down everything I could remember, things that once felt like harmless oversights, the missing keys, the strange phone calls from banks I didn't use, the manila envelope that had disappeared from my filing tray. I began to document every interaction, Every conversation, every visit from Callum, I recorded in detail what he said, what I said, what he touched, what he moved. And in the margins, I wrote how I felt. Not just facts, feelings, fear, suspicion, anger, shame. I'd never allowed myself to put those words on paper before. I was taught not to. I was taught that writing down feelings was unnecessary, that dwelling on doubt made it real, that keeping the peace meant swallowing discomfort. But that night, sitting in my own home, clutching a folder of falsified forms, I no longer cared about peace. I cared about truth. The unraveling wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was slow, private, a slipping of the self. Realizing the walls you trusted to protect you had quietly shifted inward, and now you were locked inside them. I started noticing other changes. The kitchen drawer where I kept my checkbook was always slightly ajar, despite me closing it each night. The calls from insurance representatives who knew my address but not my birth date. A calendar reminder that appeared one morning for a neurological consult I hadn't scheduled. I canceled it immediately. Callum called me 2 hours later, furious. "You missed your appointment. I didn't schedule one. I told them to follow up with you directly. You didn't tell me that." He paused, then exhaled. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He hung up before I could respond. That phrase circled in my head for days. Harder than it needs to be. Was it hard to erase someone? Or just hard when they noticed? The next morning, I hid the notebook behind a stack of old cookbooks. Then I started a second one, digital this time, disguised as a recipe file on my desktop. I took photos of everything, the forms, the prescriptions, the locked cabinet. I emailed copies to a private account I opened on a public library computer just in case. I knew he might find them, but I also knew he'd underestimate me. That was the one thing I still had on my side. His certainty that I was slipping. His belief that I was too sentimental, too confused, too fragile to fight. Let him think that. Let him smile while tightening the leash. Because now I had a trail, and I was no longer walking it blindly. The recorder sat on my kitchen table like a dare. I bought it from a secondhand shop 2 towns over, a little black device no bigger than my palm. The clerk asked if I was doing interviews, and I told her yes. That felt like the truth, because I was about to interview the version of myself no one had heard in years. I pressed the red button and waited for the small red light to glow. Then I spoke. "My name is Marianne Halbridge. I am 72 years old, and I am not losing my mind." The silence that followed was terrifying, not because I didn't know what to say, but because for the first time, I wasn't sure anyone would believe it. Still, I kept talking. I told the recorder about the cabinet, about the pills, about the documents with forged signatures and the meetings I never agreed to. I spoke about my son and how his voice had started to sound like his father's. I told the story from the beginning, not the day I noticed something was wrong, but the day I stopped believing I could say so. The words came slow at first, then faster. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I just told the truth. It felt like oxygen. After 2 hours, I saved the file and backed it up to 2 separate flash drives. One I hid behind the curtain rod in my sewing room. The other I mailed to a P.O. box I'd opened under my maiden name. The next day, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Not the family estate attorney Callum used, someone new. I found him through an advocacy site for elder justice. His name was Ellis, late 40s, soft-spoken but firm. When I walked into his office with my satchel and my notebook, he gave me the kind of look people usually reserve for lost children or war veterans. I liked that. "I'm not senile," I told him right away. "I know," he replied. "Show me what you've got." So I did. I spread the files across his desk, the altered signatures, the locked cabinet photos, the medication changes, the account withdrawals. I played him my recording. I let him read my entries aloud until the silence in the room was filled with something close to reverence. When he looked up, he wasn't smiling. "You've been building a case," he said, quietly, thoroughly. I didn't think anyone would believe me unless I made them. He leaned back in his chair. "You were right." We filed a formal petition that afternoon. Emergency reversal of power of attorney, temporary protection order, independent financial audit. Ellis told me the fight ahead would be hard, but that I'd already done the most important part. I'd spoken. But even after that, I still felt like a cracked bell. Heard, but barely resonating. I found the support group online. It met on Wednesdays in the back room of a church 2 suburbs away. The sign read, Voices Reclaimed, Family Trauma Survivors Circle. I parked across the street and sat in my car for 20 minutes. I watched a handful of women walk in, different ages, different postures. One held a thermos, another walked with a cane. None of them looked like victims, and maybe that's why I finally went inside. The room smelled like brewed coffee and cinnamon. Folding chairs in a circle, a basket of tissues in the middle, next to a box of peppermints. No one greeted me formally, they just made space. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. Then I said, My son told a state officer that I was no longer fit to make my own decisions, and I believed him, for a while. Someone across from me nodded. I stopped trusting my instincts years ago, when my husband told me I overreacted, when my daughter said I didn't listen and left, when my son started handling things for me and I let him. There was a tremble in my throat I hadn't expected. I'm scared that I let them take too much, and that there's nothing left to fight for. A woman to my left reached out and gently squeezed my hand. My name's Delilah, she said. And I spent 6 years thinking I was overreacting too, until I found my name on a mortgage I didn't sign. Her voice cracked, but her grip didn't. You're not alone, she said. And there's still something left. There's you. The group clapped, softly, respectfully, like people who understood the volume of pain a whisper can carry. I stayed after the meeting. Delilah walked me to my car, her arm looped through mine. She wore a navy coat missing a button, her gray curls tucked under a wool hat. My kids won't speak to me now, she said. But at least I know I was right. Do you regret it? Only the silence. That night, I recorded a second tape. This time I started with my mother's name. I spoke about the house she fought for, and the strength I hadn't realized I'd inherited. I read aloud a page from Faye's old journal I'd finally opened. She'd written, I don't know how to stay where I'm not heard. The next morning, I found a message in my email inbox. Subject, Are you okay? The sender was F.J. Langley, 87. I clicked it open with shaking hands. I saw something online, a small blurb about elder financial abuse cases in the county. Your name was in the article. I'm not sure if it's you, but if it is, I want to help. I've missed you, even when I didn't want to. I sat at the table, the cursor blinking at the end of her message like it was daring me to believe it. Faye had found me, after 12 years. After all the silence, after all the locked doors and missed birthdays and unanswered letters, she had found me, and she wanted to help. I didn't cry. I recorded a third tape instead. My daughter wrote to me today. She called me Mom. I think that might be enough reason to keep going. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. The walls were a dull beige, the ceiling high but somehow claustrophobic. The chairs were hard, the kind that demand your attention whether you're ready or not. A wooden clock ticked faintly above the judge's bench, steady, deliberate. I sat beside Ellis, my lawyer, with my hands folded over my lap. I wore my mother's brooch pinned to my collar. A small sunflower, bright against the navy blue fabric. It was the only thing about me that felt steady. Callum sat across the room, crisp, composed. His hands didn't shake. His tie was perfect. He didn't look at me. The hearing began with formalities. The judge, a woman in her 60s, read through the initial petition, her tone neutral. There was a clerk to her left, typing as fast as the words were spoken, and 2 women from Adult Protective Services seated behind the rail, their notepads open. Ellis stood and laid out the case, methodical, respectful, calm. Then it was my turn. Mrs. Hallbridge, please approach the stand. I stood slowly, legs stiff from the cold. I took the oath, sat, adjusted the microphone, and I spoke. My name is Marianne Hallbridge, I began, voice steady, and I am here because I was made to believe I was vanishing. I paused. No one moved. My son told this office that I was mentally unfit to make my own decisions, that I was confused, forgetful, dangerous to myself. I looked directly at Callum. His expression didn't flicker. And for a time, I believed him. A flash of Richard's voice flickered in my mind. Don't make a scene, Marianne. You always get so emotional. I pressed on. He wasn't always this way. Callum was a quiet boy, observant, careful. He saw things he shouldn't have. He learned silence from his father, how to wield it like a tool. I looked down at my notes, then closed them. This isn't about just one account, one transaction. This is about years of small erasures, locked cabinets, altered prescriptions, phone calls I never got, mail I never opened. I didn't notice it all at once, because when the people closest to you say it's for your own good, you want to believe them. I felt my throat tighten. But I'm not a name on a form. I'm not a fading memory. I'm a woman, a mother, a daughter, and I know who I am. The courtroom was still. Even the judge seemed to pause her pen. I started writing everything down, I said. Every conversation, every pill count. I recorded my own testimony because I wasn't sure I'd be given the chance to say it here. But I'm here. And I need you to hear me when I say, I am not invisible. I sat back. The microphone crackled slightly as I released it. Ellis nodded gently, pride in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Callum stood next. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. My mother's memory lapses were concerning. I wasn't trying to control her. I was trying to protect her. He gave a small smile to the judge. I manage high-level accounts. I'm familiar with risk patterns. And what I saw was instability. Forgetting appointments, duplicate payments, unopened mail. This wasn't abuse, it was concern. He gestured toward me without looking directly. She's always been sensitive, prone to overreaction. There it was again, that word, sensitive. He went on. I coordinated medical evaluations. I oversaw her finances when she asked me to. I made choices that seemed necessary, not malicious. If she misunderstood them, I regret that. But I did nothing illegal. Ellis rose. Did you inform her of the power of attorney filing? Callum hesitated. I believed I had implied it. Implied it? Ellis asked. Callum adjusted his tie. She seemed confused when I mentioned it. Did she sign the document? Callum didn't answer. Ellis held up a printout. The signature on the document was confirmed by handwriting analysis to not match her legal signature on file. Do you have an explanation? Callum's jaw clenched. The judge spoke. Mr. Hallbridge, answer the question. He cleared his throat. I believed she would approve it eventually. The room fell quiet. Ellis approached the bench and handed the judge a sealed envelope. I'd like to submit a final piece of testimony, Your Honor. The judge broke the seal, unfolded the letter inside, and began to read silently. I received this yesterday, Ellis said, from Ms. Fay Langley, Mrs. Hallbridge's daughter. The judge looked up. May I read it aloud? I nodded. The judge adjusted her glasses and read, Dear Court, my name is Fay Langley, and I am the estranged daughter of Mary Ann Hallbridge. I left home over a decade ago due to irreconcilable family tensions. My mother and I did not part on good terms. But what I want the court to know is this. My mother is not confused. She is not unstable. She was silenced. By our father, and then, I fear, by my brother. She raised me with rules she didn't believe in, because she thought silence would keep me safe. It didn't. But I see now that she was trying. Always trying. I watched the news of her case from a distance, and I felt that old ache, the one I thought I'd buried. But it rose up because I recognized this pattern. I lived it too. Please listen to her. Believe her. She has always been more lucid than anyone ever gave her credit for. Sincerely, Fay Langley. The judge folded the letter with care and set it aside. Callum was still, rigid. For the first time, his mask cracked. Barely, but enough. His foot tapped. His jaw ticked. He didn't look up. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Hallbridge, do you wish to make any final statement? I stood again. I raised 2 children. One learned how to fight, the other learned how to control. And I'm sorry I didn't protect them from each other, but I am here. I showed up, and I deserve the right to keep showing up. For myself. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you. When the gavel tapped once, signaling recess, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Ellis placed his hand gently on mine. You did it. But I knew better. It wasn't over. It had just begun. Callum didn't stumble often. He built his life on precision, words rehearsed, actions controlled. But when Ellis raised the printout and calmly asked, Can you confirm the date you sold the property on Merton Avenue? Something shifted. Callum's eyes flicked to the document. March 12th. Ellis nodded. You're sure? Yes, Callum replied, crisp. Ellis turned to the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to call our forensic accountant. Ms. Janelle Foster Janelle was in her early 50s, silver braid down her back, voice clipped and exact. She approached the stand, swore in, and opened a folder thick with spreadsheets. She began slowly, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Over the course of 6 years, Mr. Hallbridge moved roughly $214,000 from Mrs. Hallbridge's primary and secondary retirement accounts into an auxiliary checking account opened under her name, but managed through his IP address. She paused, flipping pages. These transfers were timed in consistent, low-volume amounts. $1,200 here, $850 there. None of them required authorization alerts due to thresholds carefully selected below the flagging system. Callum's posture stiffened. Ellis leaned forward. "And what about the properties?" Janelle nodded. 3 were legally sold and transferred, but 1, Merton Avenue, shows no completed deed of sale in county records. The property is still legally owned by Mrs. Hallbridge. However, rental income from that address was rerouted into a third-party holding account, also connected to Mr. Hallbridge. Callum's expression cracked, just slightly. Jaw clenched, eyes dark. The courtroom quieted. The air shifted, and for the first time in this process, I felt the weight of the room tip. In my direction. The judge turned toward Callum. "Mr. Hallbridge, were you aware this property was never officially transferred?" There must have been an error in recording. That's not how it was explained to me." "By whom?" Ellis asked. Callum paused. "Too long. I'd have to check." The words hung in the air, limp and hollow. I sat straighter. Ellis glanced back at me and gave a subtle nod, a signal not of victory but of progress. And then the real blow came, a soft knock on the courtroom door. One of the aides entered, whispered something into Ellis's ear. He turned, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Your Honor, we've received a supplemental statement. I request a brief recess to validate it before submitting." The judge agreed. Outside in the hallway, the lighting was dimmer, cooler. Ellis handed me a folded note as we stepped aside. "It's from Delilah," he said. "She's found something." The paper was light blue, her handwriting hurried. "Marianne, just pulled property records on a hunch. The Covewood house was sold legally. But Merton? It never left your name. The sale was staged. No real buyer, no transfer title. Callum's been collecting rent and hiding it under a shell name, Milestone Holdings. I have the receipts." My breath caught. He hadn't just manipulated paperwork. He'd created ghosts, fake buyers, invisible banks, false trails. He wasn't managing my life. He was siphoning it. Back inside the courtroom, the shift was undeniable. Ellis laid out Delilah's evidence, county records, leasing statements, property tax rolls, all bearing my name. Callum had forged the illusion of transfer, but never filed the change. He kept the house in my name while profiting from it under another. "Would you consider this financial fraud?" the judge asked Janelle. "Yes," she replied. "And actionable." Silence. I rose before anyone else spoke. I walked slowly to the witness stand. Not requested, not required, but I had to stand. I had to rise. The judge looked at me. "Mrs. Hallbridge?" "I won't be silenced anymore," I said. My voice was clear, strong. "My son told the world I was fading, and for a long time I believed I was, but I've been here the whole time, watching, remembering, waiting." I turned to Callum. He finally looked at me. "I trusted you," I said, "even when I shouldn't have. I gave you the benefit of the doubt when all you offered me was disappearance." The courtroom wasn't a stage, but I wasn't performing. I was reclaiming space. I caught my reflection in the paneled glass of the exit door as I returned to my seat. Back straight, shoulders squared. No longer shrinking. Ellis, Mr. Lockwood, as the court knew him, placed a hand lightly on my elbow as I sat. "You stood taller than anyone in this room," he whispered. I believed him. For the first time in years, I believed someone when they said I wasn't small. The judge declared a recess to prepare a ruling, and I breathed, not relief, not victory, but something deeper. Recognition. Because the mirror hadn't just cracked, it had cleared. And finally I saw myself. The gate creaked the same way it had when I was a child. Rust had eaten into the hinges, and ivy curled around the wrought iron like fingers unwilling to let go. But the house, though faded, weathered, and overgrown, was still standing. Merton Avenue. The one property Callum hadn't managed to steal. Not because he'd spared it, but because his paperwork had failed him. It was mine still. Mine again. I stepped through the weeds crowding the front path, brushing past dandelions that had cracked through concrete like they had something to say. The air smelled of dust and pine, and the silence carried a hum of memory. I paused in front of the old mailbox. It was still there, bent slightly to the left, the red flag chipped and faded. I wiped it gently with my sleeve. Beneath the grime, the embossed name appeared, Monsieur Hallbridge, still legible. I pulled it open, empty save for a dried leaf and the scent of rust. But it didn't feel empty. It felt waiting. I stood there a long while before I started cleaning. I didn't rush. I worked slowly, hands careful, sleeves rolled. I cleared cobwebs from the front stoop, swept leaves off the porch, tested the door. It stuck at first, but the key still fit. Inside, the air was stale and cool. A fine coat of dust covered the furniture left behind by the last tenants. But the bones of the house were good. The hardwood floors, the bay window, the narrow stairwell. It was all still here. I walked room by room, touching the walls like they might speak. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter's edge. I remembered baking cookies with Faye here when she was 9, her hair tied up, her face streaked with flour, laughing as she overmixed the dough. I stood there for a moment, eyes closed. Then I heard a car door outside. My breath caught. Faye. I stepped onto the porch just as she reached the walkway. She looked older, of course. Her jaw sharper, her hair now chestnut brown and cut just below the chin. A leather bag slung across one shoulder, but her eyes, those were still hers. Still wild, still watchful. We stared at each other for a long beat. She broke the silence. You look the same. I feel older, I said with a nervous laugh. She didn't smile, but she didn't leave. Thanks for coming, I added, suddenly unsure of what else to say. She stepped onto the porch. This place looks like a fairy tale someone stopped reading halfway through. Give me a week, I said. It'll have a happy ending. Her eyes softened, just slightly. Inside, I made tea. Neither of us drank much of it, but the act helped. We sat in the front room, on mismatched chairs, the light slanting through broken blinds in golden streaks. This was supposed to be a rental? She asked. For someone, I said. But not anymore. It's mine again. For real. She nodded, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her thumb tapped against the edge of her cup. I read everything, she said quietly. The court documents, the testimony, your letter. I held my breath. I didn't know how bad it got, she continued. Or maybe I didn't want to know. I spent so long being angry that I stopped asking questions. You had every right to be angry. She looked up at me then, her expression guarded. I didn't know how to love you the way you needed, I said. I tried to shape you into something smaller, more acceptable. And when you resisted, I took it personally. I thought keeping the peace was the same as keeping us safe. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I know what it's like to be gaslit, she said. To be told you're wrong about your own mind. You didn't do it the way Dad did, but you did it in ways that stuck. I nodded. I didn't try to defend myself. I don't expect forgiveness, I said. I just wanted you to see me now, to know I'm not lost. She leaned back, exhaled. You're not. Silence settled between us again, but it felt different now. Less like distance, more like space being made. I can't go back to what we had, she said. I wouldn't ask you to. But maybe, she added, you can learn now how to love me the way I need. Something inside me broke open at that. A warmth I hadn't let myself feel in years crept into my chest. I want to, I said. If you'll let me. She nodded. We sat there until the sun moved lower in the sky, light shifting across the walls in long honeyed beams. Dust danced in the air, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like neglect. It felt like transition. She stood to leave and paused at the door. What are you going to do with this place? She asked. I looked around. Something that matters. As she walked down the path, she turned once to wave. I waved back. The blinds behind me swayed gently in the breeze through a cracked window. The sunlight spilled through them, broken but beautiful, like me. The decision wasn't loud. It didn't come in a rush or a burst of inspiration. It came quietly, like most truths do, while I was cleaning the attic. I found the old deed up there, tucked into a weathered manila envelope, still bearing my mother's cursive. The ink was fading, but her name was still bold. Margaret J. Hallbridge, transferred to Marianne Hallbridge, her only daughter. That paper had once felt like a burden, a chain linking me to responsibilities I hadn't asked for. But now, in the soft light filtering through the attic window, it felt different. It felt like an offering. This house had been taken from me, nearly, almost, and I had reclaimed it. Not through court orders alone, but through intention, through presence, through stubborn, grounded belief in my own voice. I stood in the center of the living room the next morning, sun cresting over the rooftops, and made the choice. This house would not sit empty. It would not fade into a rental or a line item. It would become a place of refuge, a retreat, for women like me. Women whose stories had been spoken over, twisted, dismissed. Women gaslit in their own kitchens, manipulated in the language of love. Women who needed more than therapy. Women who needed space, shelter, witness. I began making calls. Ellis connected me with a nonprofit that specialized in transitional housing. Delilah introduced me to a small network of survivors turned advocates, each one with a story that sounded too familiar, too close to mine. They didn't just listen. They offered support, guidance, blueprints. The transformation was slow, but it was mine. Every coat of paint I brushed across these walls felt like a reclamation. Every repair, every polish, every light bulb replaced was a small declaration. I am still here. And so was the house. The legal deeds were stored in a new safe now, one I bought myself, locked with a code only I knew. But the more meaningful deeds were in motion. Acts of courage, conversations opened, apologies made, silence broken. It took me 3 weeks to write the letter to Callum, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I needed the tone to be exact, firm, but not cruel, clear, but not vengeful. I sat at the kitchen table, the same place I'd once recorded my voice into a tiny black device, and wrote slowly. Callum, I am not angry anymore. That doesn't mean I excuse what you did. But I refuse to carry rage. It does not belong in me anymore. You believed you were doing what was best. That's what makes it more dangerous. You convinced yourself that I was diminishing because it allowed you to feel stronger, more in control. But control isn't love. What you did was theft, not just of money, but of time, of agency, of trust. Still, I choose not to punish you. I choose not to hate you, but I will no longer allow you to decide anything on my behalf. The court has restored what is legally mine, but this letter is about what is morally mine. My name, my voice, my future. You will not contact me again without invitation. You will not step onto this property. You will not act on my behalf in any way, for any reason. If you are capable of reflection, I hope you use this time to do so, not for my sake, but for your own. I am your mother, but I am not your shadow. Marianne. I mailed it without ceremony, and then I opened the windows. Fresh air swept through the rooms, curtains fluttered, the walls exhaled. The women began arriving slowly, one every couple of weeks, referred through community centers and advocacy programs. I didn't ask for their stories unless they offered them. I made tea. I listened. I painted together with them on the back porch and showed them how to trim the hedges and scrub mildew from bathroom grout. We didn't speak of recovery as a destination. We spoke of it as a rhythm. Faye came back too. Not to stay, not yet, but she visited. Brought books, donated kitchenware, sat beside me on the porch and watched the seasons shift. We didn't talk about the past every time, but when we did, it was open, honest. You seem lighter, she said one morning. I am. You still think about him? Every day, but now he doesn't get to live in my head rent-free. She laughed at that. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small wooden plaque. I thought this might go well out front. I took it, turned it over. It read, The Hallbridge House. Established 1973, reclaimed 2025 below, that in smaller print, a sanctuary for women finding their voice. I swallowed back the ache in my throat. That afternoon, I dug a small hole near the porch steps and placed a new post. I screwed the plaque in carefully, lined it level, then stepped back. The sunlight caught on the fresh paint. The letters gleamed. For a moment, I stood in silence. And then I smiled. I turned and walked back inside, into a home no longer haunted, no longer hostage. The house had a name again, and so did I. If this story made you feel something, pause. Think about the quiet voices around you, the ones you've dismissed, the ones you've silenced in yourself. Now imagine what could happen if they finally spoke. We don't need an invitation to be heard. We need each other. Stay close. There's more truth where this came from.